The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived.
And that's the United Nations General Secretary a couple of weeks ago spelling out a crisis that we've been facing for many decades, but has got to the stage where it's now boiling point, according to Antonio Guterres.
The evidence is everywhere. Humanity has unleashed destruction. This must not inspire despair, but action. We can still stop the worst, but to do so, we must turn a year of burning heat into a year of burning ambition and accelerate climate action now.
And maybe much of that ambition lies with our young people. Young people around the world celebrated International Youth Day on Saturday. It's a day that celebrates the contributions, ideas, energy and creativity of young people in order for them to foster positive change, not just for themselves, but also for their communities and the rest of the world. Let's speak to Jacqui Corcoran, who's the communications and the PR manager with World Vision Ireland. A very good morning to you, Jacqui, and thank you indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. The theme for the International Youth Day this year was Green Skills for Youth Towards a Sustainable World. What are the green skills that young people should be learning?
Well, it's a theme that I suppose, Michael, first up, thank you very much for having me on this morning, and I welcome the opportunity to highlight this really vital area. That theme is one that really aligns with our day-to-day experiences on the ground with World Vision. We're part of the world's biggest child and youth focused independent international NGO, and we're active in 100 countries. So we're seeing the impacts of climate change on the ground, because increasingly in many of the countries that we're working in, there's a disproportionate impact on the ground there, and people are experiencing firsthand already the ravages of climate change. So I suppose this theme is about young people, preparing young people for that changing world and equipping them with the skills to cope with the increasing challenges that we're facing. We're also saying that it's time for increased youth involvement in climate decision making, because I suppose the youth of today, they're already playing a leadership role in the fight to tackle climate change, but they're not being given enough support. The youth of today are the community and political leaders of the future. So on International Youth Day, we've basically been saying it's time for increased youth action and youth involvement in climate decision making.
Is there any need to convince young people of the need, or that it is a pressing need at this stage? Is there any argument about climate change? Because you speak to older people and you'll hear people tell you that we always had rain in the winter. Sure, when I was a lad, we didn't have rain for 3 months, and all of these things have always happened in the world, and I'm sure you know the arguments better than I do, Jacqui. But do young people have any doubt that there is a climate crisis at this stage?
I think you're absolutely right, Michael, in highlighting the fact that children are probably more aware than sadly, the older generations that are in the positions of leadership. And I suppose that's where we're coming in and saying that our commitment is to supporting children and young people in finding ways to ensure that their voices are heard in the discussions that are impacting on their future safety and well-being. And as I said, climate change is disproportionately affecting the lives of particularly vulnerable children and their families and youth and families that we work with in some of the world's most challenging places. And building green skills is vital if they're to survive and thrive into the future. But I suppose one of the messages that we're also really keen to get across is that there is hope, and being proactive is what needs to happen. As Antonio Guterres said there, it's not the time for despair, it's the time for action. So for example, some of the initiatives that we're involved with is in Tanzania, for example, at a local political level, And I suppose as part of our commitment to ensuring that young voices are heard, we founded a project called the Sauti Youth Project. Sauti is a Swahili word that means voice. And this project is about supporting children to use their voices and advocate for climate action at a local political level. And I suppose another exciting aspect of this particular project is that it's actually a joint Tanzania and Galway project involving youth from both Tanzania and Galway.
And you
travel to each other's communities.
You brought a 15-year-old girl here because, as you say, it's to look at the situation in Tanzania, but you can't look at any environmental situation or any question about the impact of climate change in any corner of the world in isolation, can you? And you brought Shania Ramadani to the Oireachtas, a 15-year-old girl, to speak to politicians.
That's correct. Yeah. Shania appeared before the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence to address members on the topic of climate change and the need to have youth voices involved at every level of political decision making. And that was quite a historic moment because she was the first underage youth to address that committee. So, but it followed on for another historical moment for Shania when she visited COP27 last year as a Sauti Youth member and as a World Vision International Child Ambassador. And she appeared and spoke at a very high-profile event about children and adolescent-led action for climate change. But she spoke at that event about climate change from the perspective of a young person living in a community and a country already being ravaged by the environmental emergency. But it's a more extreme example, I suppose, in the community that Shania is in and in the Tanzanian youth that are involved in our Sauti Youth project. But even here in Ireland, young people are acutely aware, as you've said yourself, Michael, of how climate change is having an impact on their lives and, you know, the potential that it has to impact on their future. But I suppose, again, that message of action and hope and not sinking into despair, I think it's really important that we give young people, we support them in establishing a future for themselves and ensuring that they can survive into the future. And again, coming back to the work that World Vision are doing globally, we're involved in supporting families and communities around training and learning about things like climate-proof growing methods and other kind of nature restoration projects. Like we have this massive project going across a number of countries called FMNR, which stands for Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. And that's an approach where farmers and communities are regenerating trees on their land to improve soil facility and grow more crops and better animal fodder. And, you know, it brings more income and a better quality of life. So I suppose those are the kind of skill sets that we are anxious to see, you know, passed on to communities and youth, and building a future where, you know, we have sustainable and, you know, food available, readily, healthy food, because we are facing into difficult times ahead.
Yeah, and I gather a lot of your work.
I'm
sorry, I gather a lot of your work, Jacqui, in terms of education has to do with mindset and young people developing principles that they'll buy environmentally friendly food products or they'll make decisions and hold on to those principles. The other part of this is that being idealistic is part and parcel of being a young person, isn't it? More likely that the youth will be idealistic anyway than older climate deniers. But what when it comes to the future and practical decisions that young people will have to make as they get older? Will they compromise their principles if, for example, they're saying I'd never buy a house unless it was environmentally friendly and had heat pumps and all these things that we're hearing about that we should be doing to our homes, until they go to buy a house and realise that the only house they can afford has a dirty old boiler in it? Yeah,
I mean, that's an interesting point, but I suppose that is none of these things happen overnight, and that's where the idea of a just transition comes into play, where it's about fairly and carefully transitioning into more sustainable ways of living, ways that are not going to impact on the planet in a negative way that is life-threatening, not just for nature, for biodiversity, but for humankind. And so that message, I think, is something that young people are acutely aware of, and that their priorities around where they live, how they live, what they eat, and that decision making at a local level, at a macro level, can impact into the wider. Of course, we know that the big decision making has to be around industry and agriculture and change that's implemented at that much broader level, but the way people live and the lives that they live and how they advocate and put that pressure politically to ensure that their lives are safe going into the future is something that we're really keen to empower young people with, and through, as I mentioned, the Saudi Youth Project with youth in Galway and Tanzania. It really was very inspiring. We brought a group of Galway youth to Tanzania, and then a group of Tanzanian youth to Galway, and they were able to share their experiences and advocate at their particular local political levels and demand the change that they want to see happen so that their futures can be safe. I mean, we see it on the ground in Ireland with things like the increased numbers of people taking the plunge and buying electric cars, for example. I know that's something that at this stage you make the point that might seem like an expensive option that's out of people's reach, but there are other things happening at local levels around making houses, insulating houses, these sort of local level initiatives, or local energy initiatives, and broader energy. So it's about kind of making those local decisions and making the bigger decisions that are going to keep the youth of today safe so that they can be the leaders of tomorrow. And if people are interested in reading more about it, I'd be delighted if they'd look at our website, which is worldvision.ie, and look at the work that we're doing and support it in any way that you can. We're always looking for support from people.
Very good. Jacqui, I have to leave it there. Thank you indeed for joining us this morning. Jacqui Corcoran is the Communications and PR Manager with World Vision Ireland.